Somewhere along the way, you learned how to say it perfectly. I'm fine. Two small words. Nothing dramatic about them. In fact, that's almost the point. They arrive with the right smile, the right nod, the right steady voice, just convincing enough that no one asks another question. The conversation moves on. Life moves on. And so do you. You've always moved on. Maybe that's something people admire about you. You're dependable, calm, the one who doesn't seem rattled by much. When something goes wrong, you figure it out. When life becomes complicated, you adapt. People notice that. They call it maturity, resilience, or strength. And maybe they're right. But lately, I wonder if you've noticed something else. Not a breakdown, not burnout, nothing obvious enough for someone else to point at and say, "Are you okay?" It's quieter than that. Life still works. You still wake up, answer messages, meet deadlines, make plans, and even laugh at jokes. From the outside, nothing seems unusual. If anything, you look like someone who's handling life remarkably well. Yet every so often, usually in the quieter moments, there's this strange feeling that's difficult to describe, as though you've taken one small step away from your own life. Not far enough to lose it, just far enough that everything feels slightly behind glass. Have you ever walked through a familiar place and felt something you couldn't explain? Maybe it was your childhood neighborhood. The streets hadn't changed, the trees were still there, the same houses, and even the same sidewalks. Yet somehow, it didn't feel the way you remembered. Nothing looked different, but something had. That feeling fascinates me because it isn't always about the place. Sometimes it's about the person walking through it. And I think something similar happens inside us. Not overnight, and not after one bad day. More like tiny adjustments made over years, so small that each one feels reasonable on its own. Until one day you realize you've become incredibly good at functioning, and you're not entirely sure when you stopped feeling quite so deeply. Not that you stopped feeling completely. This isn't about becoming emotionless, because you still feel things, you just don't seem to stay with them very long. For instance, a disappointment arrives. Your mind immediately begins solving it. Someone hurts you. You explain their behavior before you've even acknowledged your own reaction. Something wonderful happens, and before the feeling has a chance to settle, another thought quietly appears. What's next? It's efficient. Remarkably efficient. Sometimes I think the human mind is almost too good at protecting us. Because once it discovers something that helps us survive, it keeps using it, even long after the danger has passed. Think back for a moment. Not to anything extraordinary, just younger versions of yourself. Remember how intensely you experienced almost everything as a child? A scraped knee felt like the end of the world. You cried hard, or maybe got angry. Then 5 minutes later, you were laughing hard at something else. As a child, your emotions moved, but as an adult, they don't always move. Why? Because somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many of us become experts at interruption, interrupting our tears, our anger, and even our excitement. There's always another email, another responsibility, another person who needs something, and another version of ourselves we're trying to maintain. So we quietly make a deal. Not consciously. No one wakes up and decides, "From today onward, I'll disconnect from my emotions." That's not how it happens. It's much more ordinary than that. You tell yourself, "I'll think about this later." Later becomes tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Eventually, later becomes a place you never visit. It's strange, isn't it? We imagine emotions disappear if we postpone them long enough. But they don't. They simply wait. Sometimes patiently, sometimes not. I once heard someone describe emotional suppression as trying to hold a beach ball underwater. At first, it doesn't seem that difficult. You press down, the ball stays hidden. Problem solved. Except you never get to stop pressing. The effort becomes invisible because you've been doing it for so long. That's the part people rarely see. They see someone composed, reliable, and steady. What they don't see is the quiet energy required to stay that way. Because the energy isn't spent feeling the emotion. The energy is spent making sure it never reaches the surface. And that's exhausting in ways that don't always feel like exhaustion. Sometimes it just feels flat, almost colorless. You still enjoy things. Sort of. The music still sounds good. The vacation is still nice. Friends are still fun to be around. But every experience seems to arrive with the volume turned down just a little. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Maybe not even enough for you to notice at first. Until one day you catch yourself thinking, why doesn't anything feel the way it used to? Our first instinct is usually to look outside ourselves. Maybe it's the job, the relationship, the city, or the routine. Sometimes it really is. But sometimes the shift happens somewhere much quieter, not in your circumstances, but in the way you've learned to move through them. Because emotional overcontrol doesn't only filter pain, it filters everything. And that's the trade most people never realize they're making. So when you become skilled at keeping disappointment from reaching you, joy often has to pass through the very same gate. That sounds a little strange at first. After all, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could simply choose which emotions get inside? Keep the joy, keep the excitement, keep the love. And quietly, leave grief, fear, embarrassment, and disappointment outside. Our minds would probably agree to that arrangement in a heartbeat. The trouble is that our emotional lives don't seem to work that way. Think about a dimmer switch in a room. You don't lower the light over one chair while leaving everything else untouched. The whole room becomes a little darker. Our emotions can be surprisingly similar. When we spend years teaching ourselves not to feel too much disappointment, not to become too attached, or not to get our hopes up, we're rarely turning down one feeling in isolation. We're slowly lowering the volume on our entire emotional world. Not because we want to, but because our brains become very good at one particular lesson. Strong emotions are difficult. Let's keep them manageable. And that lesson doesn't stop to ask whether the emotion arriving is painful or beautiful. It simply recognizes intensity, then does what it has practiced doing for years. It softens it. Maybe you've noticed this without realizing what you were looking at. You finally achieve something you've worked incredibly hard for. For a brief moment, there's satisfaction. Then, almost instinctively, another thought arrives. Okay, what's next? Or someone tells you news that should fill you with excitement. You're happy for them. Of course you are. But before the feeling has a chance to settle, your attention has already wandered toward tomorrow's responsibilities. It's subtle. So subtle that we often mistake it for maturity, for productivity, for staying grounded. Perhaps sometimes it is, but perhaps, sometimes, it's simply a mind that has become so accustomed to managing emotions that it no longer knows how to linger inside them. And lingering matters. Not because every joyful moment should last forever. None of them do. But because if we never stay with our experiences long enough to truly receive them, life begins to feel as though it's passing through us instead of being lived by us. That difference is difficult to notice while it's happening. In fact, it's one of the reasons emotional overcontrol can hide for so long. It doesn't usually announce itself with a crisis. Most people who experience it still go to work, answer emails, keep promises, and show up for the people they love. From the outside, nothing appears broken, which makes it very easy to believe that nothing is. And yet there are little moments that don't quite fit the story. You finish something you've been working toward for months. Then everyone congratulates you. You thank them, genuinely grateful. But before the day is over, your attention has already moved to the next problem that needs solving. It isn't that the achievement meant nothing. It did. You simply never stayed with it long enough for it to become part of you. Or perhaps you're sitting with friends. They're laughing. You're laughing too. The conversation is warm, familiar, exactly the kind of evening you would have called a good night. Then, driving home, a strange thought appears. Why do I still feel empty? Not devastated, not lonely in the obvious sense, just strangely untouched by something you know you enjoyed. Those moments are easy to dismiss. We blame stress, a lack of sleep. Maybe we're just getting older. Maybe this is what adulthood feels like. Perhaps. But often it's because the mind has become so practiced at regulating emotional intensity that it stops distinguishing between emotions that threaten us and emotions that nourish us. It simply treats intensity itself as something to keep within safe limits. This explains why some people can remain astonishingly calm during difficult times, yet struggle to remember the last time they felt deeply excited about anything. It would explain why success sometimes feels oddly weightless, why celebrations seem to end before they've really begun, and why beautiful moments have a habit of slipping past before we're fully aware they were happening. The same gate that keeps disappointment outside doesn't always recognize the difference when joy knocks. Our bodies, however, are often less convinced by the performance than our minds are. The body has its own way of telling the story, sometimes as a neck that rarely relaxes, or sleep that restores just enough energy to begin another day but never quite enough to feel renewed, or a constant sense of being on, even when there's nothing urgent demanding your attention. You adapt to it in much the same way you adapt to the hum of a refrigerator. At first you notice the sound. Eventually your brain edits it out. The noise hasn't disappeared. You've simply stopped hearing it. Until the power goes out. Only then do you realize how loud it had been all along. Emotional overcontrol works in a similar way. The effort becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like effort. It simply feels like your personality. I've always been this way. I'm just not an emotional person. That's just who I am. Maybe. Or maybe you've been carrying something for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. There's an important difference between those two possibilities. One describes your identity. The other describes a strategy. And strategies, even the ones that once protected us, can be changed once we finally recognize them for what they are. So how do you change these strategies? How do you begin changing something that's become so familiar you barely notice it's there? Probably not in the dramatic ways we imagine, not by becoming a completely different person. It begins much more quietly than that, with a pause, long enough to ask yourself whether "I'm fine" is the whole truth, or simply the easiest one, and long enough to let a feeling exist before you explain it away, solve it, or promise you'll deal with it later. Because emotions aren't problems waiting to be fixed. More often, they're messages waiting to be understood. And interestingly, that pause does something important. It interrupts the habit, the automatic urge to solve, suppress, or move on. In that small space, something else becomes possible. You can finally name what's actually there. Not the polished version, not the socially acceptable version, the honest one. Like I'm disappointed, I'm overwhelmed, or I'm scared. It's surprising how much power there is in simply giving an experience its proper name. Because what remains vague often feels overwhelming. But what is named becomes something you can understand instead of something you have to outrun. And once you've named it, you don't have to fight it anymore. You can simply allow it to be there. Not forever. Just long enough for it to do what emotions were always meant to do. Move.